I warmly welcome Christoph Chalamet from Geneva, and he's going to talk on the subject Früher, war es anders. In earlier times, it was different. Schweitzer, nostalgia, and a hope for regeneration.
Thank you very much for your kind words, James. I wish to thank the organizers of today's conference, especially you, James, but also the other people who helped out. Yes, James just noted that I am not a Schweitzer scholar, and so I'm even more grateful for you reaching out to me. I'm grateful for this invitation. I was also very grateful to be associated with this wonderful resource that James co-edited with Michael Tate several years ago. Albert Schweitzer, Thought and Action. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this volume. In his 1923 book, Schweitzer laments what he sees as a loss of genuine conversation between people. People tend to refrain their interactions to general remarks. They tend to be neglecting a real exchange of ideas, ein wirkliches Austausch von Gedanken. Or conversely, people have become so specialized within their own field of inquiry that they no longer want or can talk to one another across the scientific fields. So thank you, James. Thank you to the Schweitzer Institute for hosting this conference, which promises, and it's already confirming the promise, to stimulate an authentic exchange of reflections. And my comments today focus on the first part, and the first part only, of Schweitzer's philosophy of culture. It's this book, a little slim book, titled Verfall und Wiederaufbau der Kultur. And I'm just going to share my screen very briefly so that you may see what the structure of my paper looks like. I want to begin by looking at some religious overtones in Schweitzer's philosophy of culture. He was really a theologian, even as he was writing a philosophy of culture. Not that I want to put this theological identity on him at all. No, that's not the point. But we can detect the fact that he was a pastor, a preacher, a theologian, even as he writes a philosophy of culture. Second part of my talk will be on prophecy, because I am convinced that Schweitzer is expressing some prophetic insights in this 1923 book. I want to then take a look at how we may move, according to Schweitzer, from decay to regeneration. That's the key point in a way. And it's still the key point today. And then I will conclude. So I will stop my sharing for now, and I will return to my PowerPoint later when I have a few quotations, hoping not to miss those that I have included in that PowerPoint. So, reading Albert Schweitzer, for me, and I suspect for others as well, is always something of an event, something of a shock. To realize that it is possible, he did it, to write with such clarity, profundity, and power is a source of amazement for me. In less than 70 pages, Albert Schweitzer examines the decadence or the decay, Niedergang, of culture, the circumstances in our social life that hamper culture, the ethical foundation of culture, the path towards regeneration of culture, and finally, culture and worldview. Such a program in such a short book could appear foolish, but Schweitzer is a master storyteller and a profound thinker who does not waste many words to get to the point and to shed light on the world that was his. When one reads in the preliminary remarks that the first draft of his essay go back to the turn of the century, to the year 1900, then the amazement only becomes greater. A 25-year-old man began to write this text in a cultural context that was, of course, dramatically different from the one in which he revised his first draft, namely between 1914 and 1917, in the middle of the African primeval forest, the Urwald, before reaching the publication stage in the early months of 1923, with, of course, also the Uppsala lecture, on which he doesn't really say much in the preliminary remarks. He doesn't even mention that this text was also given in Uppsala in 1920. It's only subsequently myself that I found out about this particular context of delivery. Between the year 1900 and the year 1923, the collapse of Western civilization was patent. No one could refrain from seeing it, from acknowledging it. Could it be that already in 1900, Schweitzer sensed this looming collapse and did influential works such as Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, 1918, 1922, have any influence on Schweitzer as he completed his book? Spengler talks of an Untergang, whereas Spengler talks of an Untergang, whereas Schweitzer talks quite similarly of a Niedergang. So we heard Ulrich Körtner's comments a little bit on the friendship of Spengler and Schweitzer, but I'm very intrigued by the relation between the two intellectuals. So I read Schweitzer's pages as a fairly naive reader, one who actually discovered this text only some months ago, and as someone who is not well versed in the corpus of Schweitzer's writings. And so I hope you will indulge the rather simple remarks I will make today. First part is on the religious overtones in Schweitzer's philosophy of culture, Kulturphilosophie. Schweitzer may have proposed a philosophy of culture. The biblical and theological echoes of his theme are nevertheless obvious. Certainly, one does not need the scriptures or theological learning to speak of decadence or decay, Verfall, and reconstruction or restoration, Wiederaufbau. But in a cultural context such as Schweitzer's, that is a context steeped in the Hebrew and Greek tradition also, can one ignore the fact that the choice of the terms, the terminology which he chooses for his title, comes straight out of the book of Jeremiah, of the famous calling narrative of the prophet in the first chapter of the book that bears this prophet's name. In this narrative, God commissions a reluctant Jeremiah, and this reluctance is, of course, a topos in calling narratives in the Hebrew scriptures. God commissions a reluctant Jeremiah, appointing him over nations and over kingdom, I'm quoting, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. These 6 verbs are analyzed, of course, by Hebrew scripture scholars. Is it a mere coincidence that Schweitzer uses similar verbs as those we find in the commissioning of Jeremiah by God? Again, there's no necessity in the absolute to draw on biblical and theological sources when one speaks of decay and of rebuilding, but the connotations cannot, I think, should not be ignored, it seems to me. And this, I would further suggest, confers a certain gravitas to Schweitzer's book, as if he were somehow assuming certain prophetic overtones within his own philosophical voice, with his own intervention in the culture of his time. The terms which he uses for the title of his philosophy of culture are charged, biblically as well as theologically. Can anyone who knows a bit the history of Protestant theology, including pietism, a history in which Schweitzer was thoroughly trained, and not sense in his usage of the word regeneration, I'm thinking here of the fourth section of part 1, der Weg zur Regeneration der Kultur. Who wouldn't sense in this usage of the word regeneration a sort of clin d'oeil, a little wink, to Protestant theology? Again, I say this not in order to bring back Schweitzer, the philosopher, into the fold of Christian theology. It's not interesting at all. But rather in order to point out that even as he writes a philosophy of culture, Schweitzer, the scholar of theology, is not switched off, as it were. He really is there, lurking in the background, and perhaps not just in the background. One other example of this, among others, of Schweitzer's decision to take up the prophetic mantle is found at the beginning of the book, which is a dramatic accusation of philosophy. I mean, the whole first part, the entire first part is an accusation of philosophy, its schuld, its culpability, the philosophy of his day and age. Philosophy which should have kept watch, like the watchman in the night, neglected its calling and stopped bothering with culture. This is the quote. Philosophy was philosophizing so little about culture that philosophy, it did not even notice, that it did not, there's a little problem, that it did not notice how philosophy itself and the times in which it lived was becoming always more cultureless, kulturlos. In the hour of danger, the watchmen, which ought to have kept us awake, were asleep. And so it occurred that we did not fight for our culture. A very striking quotation. It's my own translation because I was not able to get a hold of the English translation on time. So it's my own attempt. Now the echo is no longer to Jeremiah, but to Ezekiel. And let us note this also to the divine calling and commissioning of Ezekiel by God, as narrated in Ezekiel 3, verses 16 and 17. I'm quoting now. At the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me. Mortal, I have made you a sentinel for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. Is this not precisely what Albert Schweitzer is doing in his book? Isn't he exercising the mandate of a sentinel and giving people warning? And maybe a bit more than that, also sketching ways beyond the impasse, beyond the decay. Should we then consider Schweitzer's opusculum as a modern-day Jeremiad? I raise the question, and you already see that my answer tends to be affirmative. And this is not a pejorative remark. After all, the two-edged word Jeremiah was commanded to speak, plucking up, rebuilding, was a true word, a word coming from God. Schweitzer, of course, is not a Hebrew prophet. I'm not fully versed in his biography, but as far as I know, he was not asked to swallow a book at any time in his life. But at the end of the day, the question that matters the most in relation to his philosophy of culture are the following ones. What is Schweitzer saying to his contemporaries and to his readers up to our day? Is what he was saying in 1923 relevant to us? Is it true? This, to me, is where the effort is required from us as readers of Schweitzer's book 1 century later. He himself denounces philosophy that has become merely a history of philosophy. A bit later, in the third section of the book, the historians are criticized for their lack of interest in shaping culture, for their fascination with erudition. And in the preface to the second volume, he asks what remains of philosophy once the scholarly glitter is taken away. Schweitzer could also have challenged theologians in the very same manner. Yes, we need contextualizations, historical perspectives, we need sound knowledge, and we even need erudition. These are indeed not optional. But we also need to ask ourselves what this all may mean for us today as a society and as a culture and as human beings. Schweitzer defies us to raise these questions. I move to my second part on prophecy as a premonition and truth-telling. Prophecy is often understood as the ability to anticipate future events, to foretell these events. Scholars of religion, perhaps especially theologians among them, sorry, not just them, sometimes wish to add that prophecy should not be reduced to premonition, for it primarily conveys the notion of a humanly mediated proclamation which centers not so much on the future, but on the present, or better, on the present insofar as it is orientated towards a future. Prophecy can be interpreted as a word coming from the ultimate, from what lies beyond the finite realm, a word nevertheless addressed to people, a word which encounters people in history from beyond history, if there's such a thing. Theologians often tend to believe that there is such a thing, which is no thing, of course. Albert Schweitzer's book is a prophetic book in both senses of the term. It is in many ways premonitory. It's a word, an intervention that discloses something about our present situation in the second sense of prophecy. It is both at the same time. Many examples could be adduced on the premonitory nature of his book. I will simply give this one, which really struck me. Schweitzer grasped already in 1923 that human beings, as they were leaving the countryside to live in big cities, were becoming more and more foreign to what he calls their own home and to nature. Schweitzer saw this as something abnormal, as an unnatural strain and impairment, Schädigung, on the human. What Schweitzer points out in 1923 has only become more manifest in the last century, worldwide. Dozens of millions of people in China alone have left their rural environment to work in metropolises. What does this massive migration mean for human beings and for their natural environment, their relation to the natural environment? Any answer to this question must be nuanced, but few would question the fact that human beings, for the first time since their emergence in history, have grown disconnected from the natural environment. Is this bad news for the environment? This is where the answer must again be nuanced, although it appears probably to many of us as fairly clear. But it still may need to be nuanced because it's been shown that large cities are in some ways better for the environment, at least in some respects. But the striking thing is that Schweitzer's acuity in discerning major trends in the evolution of society and civilization still resonates with us. He's unveiling some problems that are, of course, very much with us. One could say that these trends were visible to all. Charlie Chaplin is an illustrious example of an artistic response to the industrialization of society. But Schweitzer is convincing in his claim that in the burgeoning new century, the new living and working conditions of human beings, notably their overemployment, Überbeschäftigung, stunt the spiritual dimension of the human. Schweitzer's assessment could hardly be starker and bleaker. The humanity of the human is at stake. As human beings become less free, less collected, gesammelt, less independent or autonomous, selbstständig, in their inner lives, geistig, in their spiritual lives, they risk falling into humanlessness, Humanitätslosigkeit, into inhumanity, Inhumanität. This is the decay on which Schweitzer focuses in the two opening sections of the book. How does a reader a century later view Schweitzer's assessment? I've already indicated that I take Schweitzer to be in many ways prophetic, in the first sense of premonitory, but I cannot stop there. Reading these sections of his book, I couldn't help but wonder whether a certain nostalgia did not lie behind his strong claims on the utter degradation of Western culture and on the progressive dehumanizing of human beings in modernity. Has the old modern tale of progress being replaced a bit too quickly and unilaterally by a tale of decay? Früher war es anders. In earlier times, it was different, Schweitzer writes. Well, certainly it was different, but was it better? How far back into the past do we need to travel to find a culture in which the human was less at risk of losing his or her humanity? Schweitzer seems to suggest that in the 18th century, people still knew how to engage in intellectual debates. This practice, however, has since been lost, according to him. It is on this point that the narrative of decay, of a return to the Middle Ages, he writes like this, becomes less convincing, and that a measure of suspicion may emerge in the reader, at least in this one. If you've watched Ken Loach's latest marvelous movie, The Oak Tree, you have seen how important debates in which our humanity is indeed at stake are conducted, not necessarily in academic halls, in century-old colleges, but in pubs, in this particular case, in a derelict pub. On other aspects of what he sees as the cultural decay of the West, recent developments confirm Schweitzer's analysis. When he laments the sacrifice of independence of thought, which has led to the loss of the faith in truth, Glaube an die Wahrheit, when he contrasts the disorganization of our inner intellectual life with the over-organization of public life, I cannot imagine many people disagreeing with his verdict. But it is slightly worrying to see Schweitzer claim that things were different before, and to see him imply that things were better before, for they were not. Is there a period of human history during which the humanity of the human was not at stake, where battles for the soul of the human were not mercilessly and perilously conducted? Isn't the entire history of humanity the history of a battle for the humanity of the human against all of the forces, human and otherwise, that aim to bring the human into servitude, or that aim to bring a complete end to the human? I don't want to relativize everything, but at the same time, yeah, you see my suspicion. Whatever smacks of nostalgia in Schweitzer's pamphlet is worth questioning, seems to me. But in other instances, Schweitzer issues prophetic warnings to us. Prophetic in the second sense of the term, that is, as an intervention that stops us in our tracks and that claims our complete attention here and now. Schweitzer completed the text of the first part of his philosophy of culture in the wake of the First World War. We, in 2023, have been brought back to that era, to the errors that led to this civilizational catastrophe, through the war that Vladimir Putin has started in the Ukraine, but also through various regimes across the world, which are based on one of the worst ideals of modernity, namely nationalism. What is nationalism? It's not the same as patriotism. Nationalism is, according to Schweitzer, who does talk about all of this, in his 1923 first part. Nationalism is patriotism unbound, absolutized, gesteigerte Patriotismus. There is nothing noble, edel about it. Schweitzer makes an important point here. He claims that nationalism necessarily leads to war. As such, nationalism is, quote, barbarous. It stands in the way of a worldwide human culture, Kulturmenschheit. It destroys the very concept of culture insofar as it privileges national cultures, national culture in the singular. When Schweitzer denounces the sacrifice of personal morality, I'm quoting here, personal morality on the altar of the homeland, instead of standing in tension with the collectivity, instead of being a force which drives the collectivity to its perfection, end of quote, his words resonate powerfully with us. The cult of the nation has been one of the greatest sources of destruction and horror in recent centuries, and we must acknowledge that this disastrous, idolatrous belief is still very much with us, producing new cataclysms again and again. Countless lives to this day are sacrificed by political regimes of various kinds on the altar of the nation. Where does the error and perversion of nationalism come from? What are its roots? Schweitzer mentions the sense of reality and our historical sense as two origins of nationalism, as two causes of the external catastrophe of the war, in which, quote, the decay of our culture is completed. Schweitzer's use of the verb vollendet, completed, the decay, is surprising, but also when he talks about the perfection of our collectivity. Well, he writes that as if he was standing at the end of history, which in fact, a further, even more horrific stage was going to occur in the completion or near completion, but it's never a completion of the decay of Western culture 20 years after the publication of his book. Schweitzer was, of course, absolutely correct to denounce this form of idolatry, which a decade after the publication of his book would take an unheard, brutal, and evil new shape in Germany. Schweitzer is both prescient, premonitory, and prophetic in the second, more profound sense of the term. In his attack of the modern cult of the nation, we still urgently have to hear what he is telling us. Schweitzer's narrative of the modern decadence or decay is a sharp critique of philosophy's failure. Philosophy has renounced its responsibility to be a watchman. It has let civilization return to darkness without intervening because it did not even notice what was happening. Interestingly, theology does not come into view here when one could have imagined, for instance, a mention of the theological categories of heresy or idolatry. But why would he have done such a thing, which would risk confusing the disciplines and their respective discourses? Even if he adopts some of the language and the posture of the Hebrew prophets, Schweitzer remains within the bounds of the philosophy of culture he aims to articulate in his pages. And this is worthy of respect. My third and final part, from decay to regeneration. What is, how do we resolve this? How do we go from decay to Wiederaufbau, reconstruction? Is there such a possibility? Let us carefully listen to Schweitzer, and I'm going to show the quote, two fairly long quotes, so that we can just pay attention all together, you around the table, us around the screen, to his words, and maybe discuss them later. No other way for a renewal of our world can be conceived than that we become, in the midst of the old situation, new human beings that we become a society in which, through renewed disposition, we conciliate the differences between the peoples and within the peoples, so that cultural conditions become once again possible. Everything else is more or less wasted effort, for it would mean sowing not on the spirit, but on external realities. And now the second passage, again, those are my translations, my fallible translations. Kulturzustände for me was difficult to translate. You might have better options, suggestions. It quotes, real grounding under our feet is given in ethical ideals of reason, in ethischen Vernunftidealen. Do we want to be enabled by the spirit to create new conditions and to return to culture? Or do we want to receive the spirit from the actual conditions and to unravel? This is the fateful question which confronts us. The true sense of reality lies in the intuition that we come to a normal relation to reality only through the ethical ideals of reason. These two passages contain strikingly parallel claims. In the first one, Schweitzer speaks of becoming new human beings, neue Menschen. In the second one, he speaks of creating new conditions, neue Zustände. Something new needs to occur. And this new reality has everything to do with the renewal of human beings themselves. Of course, the Christian, especially Pauline theological overtones are unmistakable here too. This fact barely needs to be mentioned. The great optimism of Schweitzer arguably lies in his faith in the very possibility of such a renewal. But note that the possibility of this renewal is spirit-enabled. Spirit here does not mean Holy Spirit or God's Spirit, but something more basic and universal, an animating reality which can be found and drawn in different ways, as Schweitzer makes clear when he distinguishes two radically opposed options, one that seeks the spirit from reality as we know it, from the actual conditions, or another one that receives the spirit from elsewhere than the present circumstances in which we find ourselves. This from elsewhere signals something that in the minds of readers such as myself, theologians, may evoke theological matters where we should proceed carefully here. For Schweitzer points in a different direction than the theological one. The condition for the renewal Schweitzer writes about with both great urgency and great hope is not dependent on a divine intervention or a divine act. It depends on a spirit-enabled, renewed attention to what he calls the ethical ideals of reason. Ethische Vernunftideale. What are these ethical ideals of reason? I cannot say I found a detailed answer to that question in part one. Part two probably offers a lot more. Another aspect which is not clear to me is the relation between the individual and the communal in the regeneration Schweitzer has in mind. Schweitzer does not seem to have Schweitzer does seem to have a somewhat aristocratic view of the relations between the few and the many. Hope seems to reside with the few, who may be enabled to think again, not on the basis of empirical reality, but on the basis of the ethical ideals of reason. And then these few, this intellectual elite, might be able to spread this renewed way of thinking and living to others, to the masses. Would you agree that this seems to be Schweitzer's vision of renewal? What should we make of such a vision, if that's the vision? And we should note that this narrative of decadence and renewal implies a moment of conversion, which Schweitzer seems to locate within the individual. The echoes of the parable of the prodigal son are unmistakable in this passage. in order to reach what is meaningful, sinnvoll, out of the meaningfulness which keeps us prisoners, there is no other way than for each one to again return to oneself. The verb to return is, of course, the word of conversion, shuv, teshuvah, in the Hebrew scriptures, in Judaism, of turning around, metanoia, of course, in Greek. Here, of returning not to God, but to oneself, which is exactly what the prodigal son does before embarking on the difficult journey back to his father's house. In Luke 15, eis eauton de elthon, coming to himself, literally, which in the New Revised Standard Version is translated as coming to his senses. Schweitzer seems to envision or hope for a large-scale conversion of the masses, who should be awakened to see the grim reality of their world. But this awakening, which is a spiritually induced awakening, will not come from the masses. It will come to them from an elite who has returned to the consideration of the necessary correlation between culture and ethical ideals. Schweitzer's diptych is not quite balanced. He has much to say about the decay of civilization. We live in an age of decadence. Civilization has crumbled. One had to be completely blind not to see this and to say this in 1923. Schweitzer's analysis of the decadence is detailed and in many ways compelling. He points out certain issues that would only become more disastrous a mere decade later with the rise of fascism in various Western European countries, in countries known to many for their extraordinary cultural achievements. The second part of the diptych, however, is barely sketched in my view. Schweitzer did, of course, elaborate further on the main ethical questions in part 2 of his philosophy of culture and in subsequent writings. In 1923 and in part 1, reverence for truth, Ehrfurcht vor der Wahrheit, is placed before us as an urgent demand, whereas reverence for life, formulated as such, does not yet appear, at least not in part 1. Of course, it does appear very prominently already at the end of the preface to part 2. More importantly, it is not clear that a reinvention of rationalism and the ethical ideals of reason will save civilization. These are some of my questions concerning Schweitzer's program. Schweitzer may be placing too much hope on them, or more precisely, on the human capacity to attain these ideals of reason and to live according to them. And so I do not see clearly how Schweitzer's lectures on decay and reconstruction relate to the modern ideology of progress. Ulrich Körtner spoke about progress earlier in a very interesting way. Certainly, the legitimacy of that ideology was radically questioned by the First World War, but isn't Schweitzer still adhering to it in 1923? From what I see in my very limited view, one key aspect has disappeared in Schweitzer's way of still upholding the ideology of the dogma of progress, namely the inevitability of progress, the necessity of progress. In the 5 lectures Schweitzer delivered in Uppsala on the philosophy of civilization in 1923, the decay is a fact that can be analyzed, described, whereas the reconstruction is a calling, an urgent prescription, and Schweitzer does not seem to think that there is any guarantee that it will occur. This deep asymmetry between the description on the decay and the prescription on the reconstruction is startling. I conclude, and it's a very brief conclusion. There's much we can learn from Schweitzer's philosophy of culture. On a series of issues I've suggested, Schweitzer speaks directly and forcefully to our own historical and cultural situation today. He unveils the threat of nationalism, the fact that nationalism is prone not to peaceful coexistence, but to warfare and destruction. He notes how millions of human beings having been uprooted from their homes in order to live in cities, are losing the sense of being a part of the world, of natural life, and they may fall into the trap of an existence which is organized and structured in ways that are dehumanizing. In other words, Schweitzer compels us to think about the very humanity of human beings yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He does not convince me when he calls for a retrieval of rationalism and the great 18th century in which philosophy supposedly ruled civil life. His urgent, quasi-prophetic call to think about the ways in which the humanity of human beings is at stake, on the other hand, remains as relevant today as it was 100 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention.